Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannick, and I've been vegan for 35 years now, and I'm not just a casual vegan. I've been deeply involved and engrossed in educating myself about vegan issues for all these years, and there are still things that I learn every day. And I love that I get to share them here with you. Our interview today is so informing and engaging. I learned so much. But before we get into it, I wanted to share something else that I've learned. So, we've been in Eugene, Oregon, in the Eugene, Oregon area for almost 2 years now, and there are numerous farmed animal sanctuaries around this area, which is really cool. And just about 20 minutes south of here, there's a town called Cresswell, and there's two vegan farmed animal sanctuaries there, and they're just about 5 minutes from each other. There's Blue Barn Sanctuary and Welcome Home Sanctuary. I recently visited Welcome Home Sanctuary, and as you're driving into the town of Cresswell, in the downtown area, there's a banner over Main Street. And this banner says, "Welcome to Cresswell, home of Romeo, the tallest steer in the world." Romeo lives at Welcome Home Sanctuary and was just recently inducted into the Guinness Book of World Records as the tallest steer in the world. And I was able to meet this gentle giant, and it was really amazing how tall he is. I mean, his head is up in like the 7-8 foot area. They measure him by the shoulder. I think he's 6'4" at the shoulder. But I mean, it was really, really impressive how big and just towering he was. And something to note, Romeo is a Holstein. That's the breed of cow that's used for dairy. And so there's very few males that reach maturity. We're used to seeing the cows, the females. The males aren't profitable to the dairy industry, so they're auctioned off and slaughtered. And that's why Romeo's unique, that he was able to reach a full, tall maturity. So I'm going to play this little 3 minutes of audio from the sanctuary about Romeo. There's a group of us standing around. I start it with asking a question, and then Misty Moore is who mainly speaks, and I would just like to share this with you. I'll pick it up on the other side. So I'm curious about Romeo and how you got him into the Guinness Book of World. How did that all happen?
Simply, literally by, I don't know, it's so organic because he's almost 7. I don't care that he's tall. Like, it's so insignificant to me, except for health reasons. But like, to me, it was just tall. Like, yeah, he's a Holstein. They're tall. There's nothing significant about that or unique about that. Holsteins are tall if they are allowed to mature. The
males never get to adulthood.
Mature.
Yeah.
So it never even occurred to me to measure him or anything. He's just tall. So the 2024 winner came out and he was 6'1". Tommy, his name's Tommy, and he's 6'1". And I was like, well, I'm just going to measure Romeo out of curiosity. And they measure him at the shoulders, so the top, the withers up there. So we measured him just out of curiosity. It was obviously way higher than 6'1". So then we had our vet come. She's always here anyway. I'm like, hey, let's just measure Romeo for fun. She's like, yeah, let's do it. And we're like, he's at least 6'4". I mean, like, from what we were doing, and we weren't doing it professionally. In order to get the record, you have to apply. So we applied. They said, okay, yeah, go ahead and send us all the proof. So then we had to go through the process of proving his height. So then that was a very strict measuring process with witnesses, and it was intense. So, and then they awarded him the tallest
cow.
Yeah, the
awesome.
tallest steer award, and we were like, what?
Wow.
Okay,
Amazing.
And I didn't really want to do it because like I said, his height is not what makes him significant. Like, it is just part of who he is.
Yeah.
But through his height and his story, he's generating so much awareness. He's kind of become an ambassador for farmed animals because people don't really know about the dairy industry.
Yeah.
And through his story, they're learning. They're like, what do you mean? He was rescued from a veal crate. Like, what? Tell me more.
Oh, really? He was rescued from a veal crate?
Last
Wow.
night I gave a talk to Eugene plant-based providers, and when I talked about that at the end, I could, especially somebody online, I heard this gasp. And I said they were rescued from veal crates, and this is what happens to male. And it was like this person had never heard it before.
Or think that that doesn't happen anymore because they think we won the veal issue or whatever.
Oh, no, it's
Yeah.
still very much.
There's still a lot of people that don't even know where veal comes from.
Yeah.
Right.
Or they
Yeah.
choose not to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a disconnect for sure.
Yeah.
It's easier to just be ignorant. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
But I think it's such an amazing point that, this would not be unusual
Right.
if the males were allowed to live. I mean, there would probably be 7
And I'm sure
steers.
there are taller Holstein steers out there. I mean, honestly, I know I keep saying it, but like his height is really not that unusual. He's very just a common.
Yeah.
Like look
It's
at his brother.
amazing.
He's just a tiny.
Yeah, it's true. His brother Milo's just like maybe a couple inches shorter.
Just a couple inches shorter.
Yeah.
And there's other Holsteins out there I've seen. At other sanctuaries. Thankfully, a lot more are getting rescued, and hopefully there will be, more that can share their story like Romeo is able to do. So there's a bit about Romeo from Misty Moore of Welcome Home Animal Sanctuary. It's always a joy to go out and see farmed animals living autonomously, getting lots of love and treats, and I highly recommend trips to your local sanctuary for inspiration. Okay, so today we're going to dive deep into a conflict or the seemingly antagonistic nature of human rights and animal rights. This discord between the two is featured in various spheres, in academia, in media, in food and culture literature, food security issues, the legal sphere, and that's kind of where we're going to focus on today, as Maneesha is a legal scholar. So I hope you enjoy this very important conversation. Here we go. All right, today we have Maneesha Deckha. She is Professor and Lansdowne Chair in Law at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, where she directs the Animals and Society Research Initiative. Her research expertise includes critical animal law, vegan ecofeminist theory, and postcolonial theory. She is the author of Animals as Legal Beings, Contesting Anthropocentric Legal Orders, and she's directed an open access documentary series designed for high school and undergraduate students called A Deeper Kindness: Youth Activism in Animal Law. Welcome to the podcast, Maneesha.
Thank you so much, Hope. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's wonderful to have you. And before we get into our topic today, we always like to start the podcast with hearing your vegan origin story. So when and why did you go vegan?
Well, when was just on the cusp of entering university, so late high school. So that was 17. And why? Because
Wait, the year 2017 or when you were 17?
no, when I was 17.
Oh, okay. Okay.
This is in the early 90s. Yes, my brother had come home from university and with some pamphlets, I guess we would call them. And it was the first time that I had really, seen an animal rights type of pamphlet. And it made an immediate impression upon me. I think it was depicting a story of transport and also telling a story about a mother cow and her calf. And like so many of us, I just never thought about this. I had never seen anything like this. And I was immediately moved to at least become vegetarian. And then when I went to university about 2 years later, I just transitioned that to veganism because of being exposed to more material and then understanding the dairy industry and eggs. And so that's the first time that I adopted veganism, yes. I just always felt a lot of compassion and empathy. And, my inner compass is very oriented, I think, personality-wise, to like this sense of justice. I mean, I ended up in law school.
Right.
Law professor. So I just felt like it was terribly unjust and, just awful, the pain and suffering involved, and that was like in no way justified or fair. So that's what started me going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. My husband always says that I have a deep sense of justice, that's kind of one of my driving forces. And it's funny because I don't really see that, but he does. So yeah, I think that vegans have that kind of sense of justice.
Yes, I think maybe also, at least for myself, like really paired with a sense of compassion and just
Yes.
feeling like deeply and being so affected emotionally.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the reason I invited you on the podcast is that you gave a wonderful presentation at Arihanta Institute recently. And I really loved so much of what you said. And then there were some things that you just touched on that I felt like I wanted to know more. So I'm going to try to dig in even deeper here. But let's start kind of broadly. And what we're talking about is tensions or seemingly conflicting interests when it comes to human rights and animal rights. And there's kind of a general negative implication often between the views between culture and race and animal advocacy. Issues of colonization and race and other oppressions are sometimes held up as reasons not to protect animals in certain circumstances. So, can you give us a broad overview of this tension and what the issue is that we're talking about?
Yes, I think the framing that most people have kind of learned and accepted, at least, Canada and the United States and other similar situated countries like in the West, is that it's like a zero-sum game and hierarchy is natural. So these ideas come together to say that, well, yes, of course, now we recognize that all humans are equal, and so we must rid ourselves of these interhuman hierarchies, which of course makes sense and is right and just. But then that leads to this conclusion that means we cannot think of anyone else and their claims to kind of care or justice. If we do, it somehow undermines human struggles. And then when you probe deeper, the issue of non-human animal rights in particular, so other non-humans aren't similarly implicated, but are caught up in this kind of tension frame. But because certain human groups, especially in certain countries, very prominent in the United States, were animalized to justify their lower status or their non-human status in terms of social codes and legal codes. The idea now that we would have something so similar to animals to be on the same moral plane, that's seen as offensive because it's seen as animalizing humans that were previously animalized and only recently seen to be in the human category and still precariously in there. So what we have then is a history of human beings being animalized on grounds of gender, race, class, ability. And so now in the contemporary era, to kind of ask other humans who really don't see the animal issue as connected to these struggles to embrace animals seems to be offensive and undermining somehow of the equal status of all humans.
Mm.
And when you couple that with this perception, perhaps a reality in some instances, but this perception that, the leaders of what we think of as the animal rights movement, at least in the United States or Canada, seem to be all white, this like compounds a problem of the tension, especially on grounds of race, that animal rights is some type of white, Western, or Eurocentric issue that is taking away space and attention from issues of like anti-racism or anti-colonialism. And then when we also think of like the prominent talking points of animal advocacy, which is around food and what we eat, what we consume. And so the message kind of comes across that, eating animals is not necessary, it's not ethical, it's not just. And then, our kind of tendency psychologically is to go into defensive mode and think of the arguments, well, against this. And then what quickly comes to many people's mind is a justification. Well, no, it's actually natural. Look at our history. It's normal. Or this position of not eating animals and not killing them for food then seems to be in tension with the claims of indigenous groups who are fighting for decolonization. So that looks like then an oppositional kind of pursuit. So how can we favor animal rights if we also want to be allies or in solidarity with indigenous rights, because indigenous rights are about hunting? And so all of this is quite reductive and doesn't really understand what myself and like other scholars, have said as well, is that at least within the Western tradition, going back to the Enlightenment and even before, although of course we can see counter thinking in the Western tradition, but at least from the Enlightenment onward, you have like this dominant way of thinking of subjects in hierarchical ways based on ideas about the body and nature and culture and reason. So we have these dichotomies where we hierarchize, we order like humans and animals and plants and categories of humans based on, well, who can reason the most, who seems to be just about the body, who is of the mind and of culture, who is more just like nature and natural. And this has kind of helped us make like a civilizational type of hierarchy. It has also helped justify kind of the dominance of men over women, just adults over children. And also, of course, humans over animals and Western societies over non-Western societies. And so if you look at the animal issue from this frame, you can see that, well, the mindsets, ideologies, and reasons that we give as to why animals are inferior rely on the same type of thinking that has structured interhuman hierarchies on grounds of gender, on grounds of class, ability, race, child status. And then the world opens up, like you see more and more how hierarchies across species and across human groups or within human groups depend on similar ways of thinking. And as I've argued in others as well, what's at the base of all of this is really like this idea about the animal and who is animal and who is not, as being the marker of who deserves moral attention and certainly like legal attention and legal protection. So my work has tried to illuminate the connections and the synergies between arguing for animal rights and arguing for human rights, and to dispel the frame or the myth really that these pursuits are antithetical. That's not to say everything is an easy compatibility at all times, but the tendency to think of animal rights as in tension with human rights, specifically on grounds of race and culture and indigeneity, I think is really misleading, inaccurate, and of course unfortunate, and something that animal advocates have to be active about, consciously reframing.
Yeah. Yeah, wow, there was a lot there, and just such really good information and important stuff that we should be looking at. And I wonder if we could start when we kind of honing in on some issues and getting more focused. You've given the example of Happy the elephant in the Bronx Zoo. And you gave this example in the presentation I saw. And I was aware of this case of bringing a habeas corpus case on behalf of Happy by the Nonhuman Animal Rights Project. But you pointed out something in this ruling that was very interesting and had a racial component. Tell us about this case and your analysis of it.
So I wrote an article about that case because when I first read it, I was so struck by what I saw and then what I argued in the article to be a rejection of Happy's claim, or the Non-Human Rights Project's claim on behalf of Happy. So the Non-Human Rights Project brought this litigation forward. Their legal argument to try to free Happy from her zoo residence was something called habeas corpus. And so habeas corpus is this old writ. So writ understood as the word W-R-I-T. So that just means like a way of coming to court and asking a court for a remedy, for a solution to a problem. that is long, long standing. And habeas corpus allowed someone to challenge detention by another because the detention was unlawful or illegal. And so you could come to a court of law, which is supposed to guard legality. That's the nature of a system based on the rule of law, to make sure actions are legal and lawful, and demonstrate why the detention at issue is unlawful or illegal. So this was this long-standing legal kind of tool that was invoked and kind of given new life with the Nonhuman Rights Project litigation. The big problem for this argument to succeed is the fact that, at least in the United States and most countries around the world, habeas corpus has not been a legal remedy that has applied beyond a human beneficiary. So a human in detention whose detention is challenged.
Right.
So
And most law is based on precedent, right? What came
yeah,
before, should we do the same, right?
exactly. So the
Yeah.
common law legal system, which is what we have, or what you have in the United States and Canada, is one very much based on precedent. That means when you go to court and ask a judge to do something, they're just not supposed to do it because, they like you, or because they think they think it's right. Rather, they must be convinced that this is the right legal result. And what is the primary persuasive kind of ingredient or tool to assess what is legally right is to see what has happened legally in the past. So in Happy's situation, arguments were made about the common law and the legislative scheme that, very creatively, that the Nonhuman Rights Project adduced to say that, okay, there is precedent in our legal system to extend habeas corpus to animals, but yes, it is an extension, but this is why it makes sense to do it now. Like our precedent, the values of our legal system about dignity, autonomy, equality actually demand that habeas be extended to animals. And it was a 7-judge court, and 5 judges constitute the majority. And so that's the decision that prevailed, and 2 judges were in the minority. And so I have argued,
And Happy lost.
yeah, Happy laws
It was, yeah.
and yeah, and Happy is still in the Bronx Zoo.
Yeah.
And so, and the remedy that the Non-Human Rights Project was actually hoping for was to have Happy go to send her to sanctuary. The majority's reasoning, to me, and I try to, show persuasively why my reading of the case does make sense in my scholarship about this case, was very much based on anxiety over race. Some anxiety over disability, but most anxiety over race. And so what do I mean by that? Well, there were many submissions made by different parties before the court. So of course, the main parties, like the zoo and the Non-Human Rights Project, but there were also parties who are like called friends of the court or interveners. And I was one of those interveners, and so were many other different scholars. Interveners aren't really on the side of anyone. They're there to inform the court about their scholarship or their work in relation to a case. But what I was suggesting was more in line, obviously, with the Non-Human Rights Project. And then there were also interveners on the side of the zoo suggesting as to why it would be a mistake to extend habeas to Happy. So a lot of this wasn't about animal rights, but it was more about what does the recognition of animal rights do for human rights. So with the extension of habeas corpus to Happy, to elephants, to animals, the Non-Human Rights Project is asking the court to recognize a fundamental legal right, which is not recognized for animals now. What does that mean? A fundamental legal right is like the right to liberty, right? The right to autonomy, differently expressed, the right to life. These are not rights that animals have, even if we might say something like anti-cruelty statutes give them a very, weak type of right, which some scholars argue. I myself do not see it that way, because I think of rights as fundamental, like they're protections against being exploited by others. So animals do not have these rights against protections, these fundamental legal rights against being exploited by others. So had Happy been recognized as possible beneficiary of habeas corpus and been sent to sanctuary, then yes, it would have been a really monumental decision, at least for Happy, at least for one elephant. And so, part of the concern is like the Pandora's box. Oh, well, we open it up for Happy, then what? The whole society is going to be discombobulated. And yeah, that might be true and probably is. But I didn't see that at all as the driving concern here of the majority. They heard arguments and submissions that danced around and sometimes then squarely addressed the issue of, will human rights be undermined by extending rights to animals? And the submissions on different sides address the point about, well, specifically, the United States has a history of deep and profound racism, also, of course, in the form of slavery, but still lasting in different forms. And what does it mean to extend habeas corpus to an animal? This would be putting them on the same plane as African Americans, and that's just offensive. That was in my reading of what the majority is saying. So it's just this full stop of, I'm offended that we would even talk about animals in parallel with human groups, especially African Americans, because of our history in the United States and because of the potential for dehumanization for Black Americans today. The majority says this kind of in one telling paragraph where they refer to the judgments of their colleagues, the two dissenting judges who each wrote a judgment of their own. So we have two dissenting judgments, where those dissenting judgments anticipate the majority's concern, kind of read it like I did from this one paragraph where they call these comparisons odious. And then the dissenting judgments do a lot to unpack why it's not racist, basically, to think of habeas corpus for animals and to look at the common law precedent about habeas corpus, because this is the problem of comparison that the majority is kind of getting offended by and saying is odious, which is the adjective used in the judgment. Because of the system of precedent, the Nonhuman Rights Project has to show, what has our society, our legal system done about habeas corpus in the past? And now can that law on habeas corpus, the principles that have been established through these previous cases over centuries, now extend to animals? And the Nonhuman Rights Project is arguing yes. But to show that precedent, they have to discuss that precedent and how it relates to animals. So that precedent is obviously attending to the formal legal oppressions that multiple groups of humans face. So women, Black Americans, and children. So you have arguments about, look at how habeas corpus liberated women, liberated Black Americans, liberated children, and now is the time to liberate animals, if we look at what those cases were about and what animals are facing today. So this is the parallel that the majority says they do not want to make, and they think is actually undermining of racial equality, basically dignity, and because it's dehumanizing, it's equating these groups of humans with animals. And really, they were most concerned about race.
And this, of course, this concern, this comparison of non-humans and human animals, it does need to be done with, if it's done at all, done with care, with sensitivity, of course. But the two dissenting judges in the minority actually did say that including animals or extending the right of habeas corpus to animals was important and beneficial to oppressed communities. So talk about what they said and how they saw it.
Yeah, so the two dissenting judges, who are racialized judges themselves, basically gave that thoughtful unpacking, right? That sensitive, thoughtful unpacking, saying, yes, given American history, these comparisons must be made carefully and not willy-nilly, but then show why the comparison is just. It makes sense from their perspective. Then actually cite like kind of animal law scholarship that attends to these issues as well, to kind of bring up some of the points I made earlier about why we can see connections and why the pursuit of human equality actually may depend on how we treat animals and the need to treat animals better. Justice Wilson actually referencing what I had mentioned earlier about indigenous cultures, indigenous rights being more friendly to animals and their worth and moral and legal regard. And so the dissenting judges are trying to take on the majority's odious characterization of the comparison to say why it's not odious, why it doesn't hurt the rights of human beings to think of habeas corpus for animals. So there were a lot of really groundbreaking moments of the dissenting judges in this type of conversation about race and animals and animal rights and human rights, how they relate to each other, and why furthering the legal situation of animals, bettering it, is not a detriment to human rights for vulnerable groups, especially on race. At the same time, there were limits drawn and kind of the requisite statements about, of course, nobody's saying humans are equal to, or animals are equal to humans, which I think are unfortunate because it still kind of leaves intact a human exceptionalism. And the concern is also about people with disabilities. One of the ways of arguing for animal rights is to show the inconsistency in the laws, because mostly we exclude animals on the justification, well, they're not human, they're not human, they can't reason. And then the retort to that is say, well, there are a lot of humans who can't reason, for example, babies and people who are cognitively impaired. So then the concern is that, well, if we bring in animals, it's going to undermine the dignity of adults who are, not paradigmatic reasoners, who are cognitively impaired in some way, because there's nothing to kind of ground their special claim to rights, because they can't reason at this level that we expect. And if we now blur or like take away the human barrier to getting legal rights and by extending it to animals, we're saying that you don't have to be human to be meritorious as a rights-bearing subject. And so then it's not clear what is upholding then the rights claims of people who can't reason very well. So it's, I myself find that argument difficult to kind of take in, but that's the concern, that the clear line between humans and animals protects humans who don't seem to have the requisite human capacities that we say distinguishes humans from animals.
Right, but like you said, it's not a zero-sum game. Why can't there be compassion and protection for both extended in the same way? What
Yes.
what is the argument that it would hurt? How would they see that it would hurt the human protections?
Well, so this argument is very nicely drawn in multiple sources in a very recent book by legal scholar from Europe, Raphael Fessal, and the book is by Oxford University Press, More Equal Than Others, where he lays out this argument that is often made and tries to kind of respond to it. So the concern is that, how can we justify the rights of humans who don't reason when we say not being a reasoner is the reason animals don't get rights? Well, what do we say? We say, well, we just ground the entitlement to rights on being human. So
Mm,
far. And if we take away that kind of human grounding, and we would if we extend to animals, well, then there's nothing left for humans who don't reason at this presumed so-called human level to be seen as human. They're going to be dehumanized.
I see. I see. Well, couldn't it be then the focus is on the suffering and lack of autonomy of a being? I don't know. Anyway,
Yes, no, I would definitely see it that way. And then I'd also, I would answer that claim by pointing to the scholarship I referenced earlier that strongly suggests that unless you are including oppression along species lines, you really can't get at the heart of other types of oppression. You'll never really root it out because being animalized is always going to continue to carry a stigma that then dehumanizes.
Mm,
It's always available to dehumanize the next group. Right,
right.
as we see like in current human conflict around the world. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so you've said that when these comparisons of animals and humans are made, that we're looking at it from a Western perspective, and animals are always seen as a demotion or lower than human or worse than human. It's not really always that way in all cultures are all thinking, and some indigenous cultures wouldn't necessarily always see animals as lower or bad and actually revere and respect animals in many instances, at least in theory or philosophy or history, not necessarily in practice or the practical way we live in modern society. But I really love this thought. Can you expand on this a little?
Yes, I mean, part of the article at the end is to talk about the article about happy, is to point this out. Now, we understand the history as to how animalization, resulted in such harm, trauma, and devastation for many human groups. But it's not the case that being an animal is seen to be a negative across all human cultures. It resulted in that type of devastation because of Western mindsets about what an animal was. And the hierarchy that was then applied to say, well, these humans are like animals, so we're going to treat them at a much lower, different way. So if we recall that that's not a universal value, right? And certainly animals don't see themselves as negative. But if we just restrict ourselves to human cultures and think of more positive estimations, as you mentioned, indigenous cultures and other religious traditions as well, of being animal, of being human and animal together, of being part human and part animal, like these types of figures, mythical idea kind of coming in more contemporary form as, let's say, shape-shifting, are, if not celebrations of being an animal, at least like respect and like normativity about having animalized parts or having animalized identities or having animalized relationships, or even like thinking of one's family as like kind of in like a certain kind of animal niche or part of an animal clan. So that's a much more positive and just kind of neutral valuation of the animal, if not, even more celebratory, as I was mentioning. So being animalized in that context is not a stigma. It's not an abject status, as it is just presumed to be in the social order that gives rise to the legal systems we have now, which is one where being animalized is, and being animal is seen to be a lowly status and then could justify harm and exploitation and violence toward others that is just seen to be natural or right or justified.
So you touched on this thing that you called interspecies model of prejudice in your talk that I heard, and I'd really love to hear a little more about this. What is this interspecies model of prejudice?
Yes, so that is coming from psychological research and academia, which, at a very basic level, we can understand as research that shows that people who express negative attitudes toward animals and justify speciesism are often going to be also justifying intrahuman hierarchies. So that dominance expressed toward animals and justified toward animals also correlates with believing in hierarchies amongst humans. So the interspecies model of prejudice is something that scholars like myself point to as, a counter argument against something like what the majority was saying in the happy case, that if we uplift animals, we're going to dehumanize, meaning hurt vulnerable human groups. But the interspecies model of prejudice basically says, well, if you maintain an ideology, if you maintain a mindset that demotes animals, that usually upholds the intrahuman hierarchies that you want to dismantle. So in line with the research that's not necessarily from psychology, but otherwise harkening back to kind of the dualities and dichotomies we were talking about from Enlightenment thought of reason over emotion, of thinking the mind is better than the body, of culture over nature, and then putting different groups in these categories to justify hierarchies, for example, of men over women or Western cultures over non-Western cultures. We see that discrimination and oppressive attitudes toward non-humans, like non-human animals, tracks with discrimination and oppressive attitudes toward within human groups, which is not surprising because, where are these ideologies coming from that give us this stance of, well, humans are superior to animals. It's ideology that's related to the arguments that say certain groups of humans are better than other groups of humans. So you can unpack it more, and there's more detail to be given, but that's what it is in a nutshell. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Very interesting. Well, I would love to hear more, but we have so much I want to get to. So, can you give some examples of authors or others that are from marginalized cultures but have embraced vegan ethics? I mean, there's a lot of people from different cultures, different races, different places in the world that are embracing a compassionate vegan lifestyle. And also, we talked about indigenous cultures, and we think about them kind of only focused on hunting and fishing, and like that's all they do for sustenance. However, so many were plant centered as well, indigenous cultures, and plant forward. And there's been a lot written about this. So I'd love to hear a little more about this, and if you have any examples.
Yes. Well, with respect to Indigenous scholars, like in the Canadian context, there is the writings and the actual person of Margaret Robinson, who's in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology, I believe, at Dalhousie University, who has written a lot about how her vegan ethics and how she sees that as very much an expression of what it means for her to live a life according to Indigenous values. And she's very much informed in her work by feminist care tradition in animals, or what we might call vegan ecofeminism as well, in terms of coming to that position about, what do animals need? What are traditional indigenous teachings? And how does that then relate to food and food ethics and just social justice in general? There are other scholars as well. A prominent piece is by Craig Womack. The article is called There's No Respectful Way to Kill an Animal, I believe, or something almost along those lines, where basically he talks about his experiences hunting as an Indigenous person, and how he has come to see it and become vegan. So those, just two examples from academia in the Indigenous context. Like in the literary context, there's recognized and feted author Eden Robinson from where I'm situated, what is now known as British Columbia, who's written several novels, but her Trickster trilogy tracks various stories, but it is a lot about Indigenous characters, either being vegan, becoming vegan, relating to other Indigenous vegan characters. And I just recently read a academic article discussing the piece, as to how Edenson in this work really challenges us to reframe our identity of indigeneity and veganism as being somehow antithetical. And again, like Margaret Robinson's work, through centering Indigenous women and their journeys in these novels and taking up the arguments of ecofeminist theory, vegan ecofeminist theory, the narrative kind of comes together, and a real contestation of non-veganism as an expression of colonialism, rather than what we are normally told is that veganism is the expression of colonialism.
Mm.
So we also have, outside of kind of Indigenous cultures and communities, so many examples of otherwise racialized peoples being vegan. You can just think of the whole world and the statistics outside of primarily European nations or ancestry European nations about the incidences of least vegetarianism. And of course, India is a prime example of that, but also the growing incidence of veganism. And even if you just kind of do a closer look at a country like the United States, you will see so many examples, for example, of Black veganism, right? So many websites, so many cookbooks, scholarship, political figures like Angela Davis who are vegan. And I mean, once you start searching, like the examples are almost endless. The unfortunate representation, though, is not to visibilize this unless it's actively kind of unearthed.
Yeah.
So we're left with the perception that veganism is some white, Western, European thing, and also with the, again, perverse perception that caring about animals or making positive legal change, social and legal change for animals, is somehow the interests of Western countries,
Yeah.
by the history and the current presence. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there is so much going on in other areas of the world now, South America, Brazil, the Asian countries. There's a lot of vegan activism happening around the world that we don't hear about. And I'll just add that there are some other really great books by AFCO and Silco. One's Afroism, Essays on Pop Culture, Feminism, and Black Veganism from Two Sisters. And AFCO also wrote one called Racism as Zoological Witchcraft. It says combining critical race theory, social commentary, veganism, and gender analysis. So that is interesting. And then I know Lantern Publishing has a couple of anthologies that are really good as well, Sista Vegan and Brother Vegan. So there's a lot of wonderful books out there in this genre. I'll put links to some of these in the show notes. So let's kind of talk about solutions or how we can dismantle and dissolve these tensions. This general, feeling or concern that uplifting animals will demote humans that are still in marginalized or oppressed conditions or systems. How can we help dissolve this tension? What are some points of comparison and connection that will help this?
Yeah, so this is something I've also discussed in my work. And I actually wrote an article addressing what I argued was just unfortunate and misleading nature of pitting animal rights against indigenous rights, and suggesting that a really potentially productive way forward would to be test out discourse from animal advocacy that focused on the dairy industry rather than the idea of meat and stopping to eat meat. So this article was called Veganism, Dairy and Decolonization. And what I argued there was, because of what were discussing earlier as to the entrenched framing, cultural and legal, of animal rights as being against indigenous rights or solidarity with indigenous peoples, because it goes against hunting, fishing, and trapping. I suggested that, we're at an impasse where invariably arguments about not eating animals comes to this sticky point about, well, what about indigenous rights? And then the support kind of dissolves away from animals because people are wanting to continue what they perceive to be solidarity for indigenous peoples by saying it's okay to eat animals for everyone. So what I've suggested is one solution is for animal advocacy just to talk more about the dairy industry, because the dairy industry avoids all these pitfalls that, arguments about don't eat meat, even in, today's age of more and more knowledge about climate change and the negative externalities of eating animals through the ways we do, and just the whole animal agricultural system. People are still kind of defending this for, interesting psychological reasons, and also for these types of political reasons about solidarity with what they perceive to be the rights of vulnerable humans. I think if we switch to a dairy prominent kind of campaign, that these types of retorts or concerns fall away, because there is such a strong association of the rise of milk with the rise of imperialism and colonialism. But for colonialism, imperialism, you wouldn't have this globally ubiquitous practice of human beings drinking milk of cows and some other animals. So if we focus on dairy, it helps us see the alignment that is there when we focus on other animal issues, but it's hard to see because of the negative framing or the antithetical framing between rights of racialized peoples, indigenous peoples, and animals. Just doesn't make sense, that framing with respect to dairy. And when dairy very quickly, in a way that perhaps other animal issues don't, once you start talking about it with people, about a mother giving birth and then losing her child just so that humans can take the milk of that child, immediately attends to what so many reproductive justice campaigns in the human context attend to, and what the whole idea of relational ethics in indigenous cultures also attends to: the importance of family, the importance of autonomy and protection of women and children, the importance of equality, the importance of keeping family bonds flourishing, not devastating them, about intergenerational trauma and how that starts with severing children from their mothers. And so, again, the story that we are legitimately, as animal advocates, able to tell about dairy as to why it's wrong and its multiple harms easily lends itself to showing synergies rather than to coming to this quick conflict after maybe the third talking point about, well, what about indigenous rights to hunt and fish? Or what about eating meat? Just animals' flesh seems to be natural, right? And so I think that's one way, in certainly I've tried to do with my academic work, but just in a larger public sphere, we can show the connections that are mutually constitutive of oppressions among human groups and oppressions against animals to combat both. They're all at the same time. Secondly, I think it's important to have stories like Ian Robinson's and other types of emotionally resonant work that in a way that an academic article may not be. But you have novels, you have documentaries like Blackfish. At a certain level, stories tend to move us more.
Yes, absolutely. Storytelling is critical. Yeah.
Yes. And so then pointing people, as I did, to stories by, representatives of groups that they respect. Like, so on this issue of, well, it's okay to be indigenous and vegan, for example, look at these indigenous vegans who are saying this and who are living their life this way.
Yeah.
Like, that's really important to be able to point toward, because if the resistance is coming from, well, this is just, a white Western thing, then you have to show, well, then it's not. You kind of have to show the counterexamples in a way that's convincing to the objectors. So, I mean, very recently I had to give a talk to my whole first year class, the new law students coming to the school, on the issue of personhood and engaging these topics of and questions in the Q&A period, as we're discussing now, but what is imagined to be a tension between racial equality, decolonization, and animal rights. And, so that is something that I did. I pointed them to, I'm not just saying this. I am a racialized person, so it is easier for me to say this, right? But also pointing to other indigenous scholars and literary figures that do this, so they can see like the momentum and scope for this in a way that was, seemed to just to be narrow for them before.
Yeah. I've got to get these stories out there. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, Maneesha, we need to wrap up. This has been really, really amazing information, but we do want to ask the last question, and that is, what gives you hope for the future?
Looking into the eyes of my little one every day gives me hope on so many levels. And I really do see hope in the very youngest generation of humans, and
'Cause you
even,
you have a young son. I just want to make
yes,
that's who
yeah,
you mean. Yeah.
yes. And even in kind of the young adult generation, because I do see now, and we see it in statistics too, avid interest in these issues, that I think in terms of the numbers, in the countries that, are globally dominant and certainly are the highest animal kind of using countries, I think the momentum is palpable, and I feel hopeful that when we have conversations like this one, we reach adults that can have an impact on the next generation coming up. I recall some statistic, which I usually tell my students at the end of a semester. There's an academic study, I think, out of the US about political movements in the last several decades, nonviolent political movements, and how it took a very small percentage of the population, I think it was 6%, kind of being visibly protesting an issue and visibly asking for something different, for that change to eventually came about. So when there was a critical mass that wasn't so large of this percentage in the society, the change they were asking for eventually came about. So that also gives me hope. Thinking about, they are few and far between, but thinking about the examples where we've had social change, the immense social change, and difference in conversation on certain issues outside of the animal context, yes, but on issues that I thought, certainly were never going to get the attention they deserve. So, we can think of Black Lives Matter as one of those issues where the dial radically shifted in a way that probably nobody anticipated.
Yeah.
When I learned about systemic racism and structural racism, I learned that like in an academic course at university, which was just like this niche type of space. And most people don't really understand what that is unless they've taken a humanities or social science class about that. And you have a professor who wants to teach you that. But now I would say, a much greater portion of the public understands what this concept is and believes that, does exist in society and it's a problem. The same thing with the Me Too movement. I mean, if you take the news just of recent high-profile cases getting attention in so many countries in a way that they may not have, and certainly low-profile cases getting attention. And there are other issues like this in the human sphere. Of course, in the Canadian context, indigenous rights is an issue like that. When I went to school, and I'm talking about university 25 years ago, I heard nothing about indigenous rights unless I took a specific course on political theory in relation to that. And certainly when I was going through the elementary school system, I mean, it was just bereft of any type of knowledge or critical stance on colonialism. And now, of course, that conversation has so dramatically changed in Canada. Again, it's not to say it's a panacea or anything like that, but the point is that there's much more attention to thinking about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, how to domesticate that, to bring that into Canadian laws, how to inform the whole civil service of these values and in their decision making. This is a huge change from just a generation ago. So it is possible. And now there is momentum for animals in many spaces, politically and legally. Not a lot of practical results, especially for farmed animals. A lot of this momentum is for wild animals. But I do think it's of a nature that it's going to be hard to stop. And with the help of younger generations, it will go forward.
Wow. Well, thank you for all those very hopeful thoughts. It's true, we have come very far in the last couple of decades, and it's incredible to see. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I've learned so much, and I think it's really important things to talk about, to bring to light, and to try to resolve and solve and soothe. And yeah, thank you so much for your wonderful, dedicated work on this.
Thank you, Hope, for asking me. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast. Just some concluding thoughts about this episode. I feel very strongly about human rights, about human issues, trans rights, housing and food insecurity, the global situation for people around the world. I want people to know that you can be a social justice warrior and an animal freedom advocate. There is room enough in our hearts for both. They can support each other, they can inspire each other. You don't have to spread yourself too thin as far as the work you do and work on everything, right? Either if you volunteer or if your work is in these fields, whatever you do to help, you can certainly focus in on one issue, of course, but we can hold all these issues in parallel with each other, supporting and finding common ground, places where we can incorporate and uplift other issues that connect us, right? So, looking for those opportunities and knowing that they're not in conflict, but that we're just expanding our circle of compassion to incorporate more of the planet, more of the world, more sentient beings under our umbrella of love and care. So please share this important episode with friends, with your networks. If you're listening on an app, please hit us up with a 5-star rating so that we can help spread this information even further. Have compassion for everyone, human and non human, and live vegan.